Welcome to Echo 1 SSGN Project 659 Subbrief. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the sources. Again, SaturnX came through with a lot of photos for today's lecture. So a big thank you to Mr. SaturnX. He is a Patreon. He is here. So make sure you guys leave him a comment in the comment section just saying thank you, because a lot of the photos you're going to see today came from him. We also use deepstorm.ru, which is a Russian-sourced website maintained by the crew members of a lot of these submarines and other administrators. So a lot of the stories and experiences not only come from the engineering and deck logs, but they come from the crewmen themselves who were on board when these events happened. And so we get their perspective. And that type of perspective is called a primary source and is absolutely invaluable. So thank you to deepstorm.ru for providing that. Without this website, I don't know how these lectures would be a thing. So big part of what we do here. FAS.org is a great website that talks about a lot of nuclear powered related things. It's Federation of American Scientists is what FAS stands for. And they're really just for, peace, basically. They're trying to talk about things that affect the globe. And part of that is navies, and then they drill that down to nuclear powered vessels, including submarines. And so I use their nuke guide for some of the information you see here today. I also cracked the book on the National Institute Guides of the World Naval Weapons, 1997-1998, where they talk about the P5 and P6 Shadok missiles that we'll be talking about today. And submarina.org, another website that we've used in the past, and we found a photo there we liked, so I snagged that, and I want to credit them for the photo. So thank you very much for submarina.org for your contribution. Let's begin. 25 August 1956 is when we begin. There is a technical project. This one's numbered 659. NATO name Echo is authorized in parallel with project 658, NATO name Hotel. So this is where we need to begin putting these things together. There is a wave of submarines that comes out of the Soviet Union simultaneously after World War II. And NATO calls these Type 1 nuclear submarines. And there are 3 of them. There are the Hotel-class ballistic missile submarine, the Echo-class cruise missile SSGN submarine, and the November-class fast attack SSN submarine. So we have all bases covered here in Type 1 nuclear submarines: ballistic missile, cruise missile, fast attack. Today we're talking about the cruise missile submarine, NATO name Echo. But all 3 of those submarines were designed and built at the same time using the same engine room. They have the same reduction gears. They have the same number of shafts. They're essentially, the rear end is the same. The propulsion plant is the same. What is different about each of these submarines is the mission and how they're built. So today we're going to talk about the Echo class SSGN cruise missile submarine. Its chief designer is P. Pusnitsev, which is one of the major submarine designers of the time for the Soviet Union. He is going to develop a nuclear attack submarine with rocket weapons, basically a flying bomb, to strike naval bases, ports, and industrial centers. This is not a very accurate weapon by today's standards. There's no GPS at this time. It basically flies on a bearing until it runs out of fuel or the timer runs out, and then it explodes. Because of this inaccuracy, it is a nuclear cruise missile, because it cannot even be targeted at, say, a specific building. It is simply aimed and launched in the direction of a naval base or a city or a port. And it is expected to get in the vicinity of that port and then explode with a large enough warhead to disrupt operations at that port. This missile is called the P5 Petorka SSN-3 Shadok. There is a P6 that is a modified Shadok that we'll be talking about later, but we're going to begin with the P5 Shadok. This is a turbojet powered subsonic Mach 0.9, 350 kilometer range, 200 kiloton warhead cruise missile. And it is basically launched from a surfaced submarine. This is not a submerged launch. Submarine surfaces, raises the launchers, a rocket burns and pushes the missile up into the air away from the submarine with enough force to push start the turbojet. It's like pushing your car down a hill and popping the clutch to start the engine. That is what's happening here with this missile, is the rocket motor is pushing the missile so fast through the air that it jump starts or push starts the turbojet engine. And from there, the turbojet engine takes it on the predetermined bearing for a predetermined time, or until it runs out of fuel, at which point it explodes in a 200 kiloton mushroom cloud. All right, so October 1957, this technical design is complete and it is approved for construction. The Echo SSGN has 6 P-5 rocket weapons that are nuclear capable. The missiles are delivered in nitrogen-filled sealed containers and are installed topside. So it's like almost like a modular system where the submarine, when it's in port, may not have the missiles installed at all, and there's no way to get to the missile compartment inside the sealed container from within the submarine. They are brought over by a crane and basically locked in place topside on the submarine, and they fit flush with the hull. The firing sequence is kind of unique. It is 6-3-2-5-4-1. So it goes starboard, port, starboard, port, starboard, port. And the reason why it alternates like this is to help maintain some kind of trim and ballast on the submarine during the fire, and especially after the fire. You don't have a lopsided submarine. And so it alternates sides as it shoots its missiles aft to forward. All right, so the Echo 1 designed by the numbers. It is a double hull construction like all Soviet submarines at this time. It weighs about 5,000 tons submerged. It's 111 meters long and only 9 meters wide. So pretty narrow submarine. It has a 300-meter test depth, which is typical for the time. It can reach a speed of 26 knots, so it's comparable to the November class, which again shares the same engine room as the November class. So this is not surprising that it has similar operating envelopes. It does have 2 40-centimeter torpedo tubes and 4 53-centimeter torpedo tubes. So it has alternating size of torpedo tubes. The 40 centimeters are electric torpedoes, relatively short range, whereas the 53-centimeter torpedo tubes are the standard size and thermal. It is a 2 BMA pressurized water reactors pushing turbines that turn 2 screws. They're independent of each other. 2 shafts make 17,000 horsepower each for approximately just over 35,000 horsepower. It has a 50-day endurance and a crew of about 90 people, which for a Soviet submarine is a little bit high. But again, this is the early days. They haven't, automized much, and so they still have a large number of crew, and that really cuts their endurance down. So a relatively large crew for a Soviet submarine. All right, these are built on the Komsomolets Amur shipyard. All of them, the entire Echo 1 fleet, is a Pacific Ocean submarine, and they're all built right here in this shipyard. Okay, the primary mission is to target American major ports and military bases. So obviously Seattle was a primary target because of the Boeing industry there in Seattle, Washington. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii for the naval base. San Diego, California for its naval base, and the Panama Canal. So the idea was to park these within, 300 or so kilometers of these cities and wait for orders to launch. This mission makes it a strategic missile submarine. Even though it uses a cruise missile, not a ballistic missile, its mission is strategic. It's not out there hunting carriers or other submarines. It's out there waiting in a fixed position to attack an industry or a naval base or a strategic value location like the Panama Canal. Let's talk about the first one, K-45. Sea trials began in November 1960. So obviously this took a long time to get together, but it is the first one, so that's expected. Sea trials did reveal numerous failures. The periscope, for example, leaked really bad, had to be replaced so they could continue testing submerged. The primary loop vacuum compressors failed, scrambling the reactor for safety. So the vacuum compressors are part of the loop that keeps everything condensed and moving. to keep the reactor cool. Well, that failed, so they had to go back into port and fix that. The sea filters, where they bring in sea water to help cool secondary systems and the secondary loop, those filters kept clogging up because of poor design and perhaps the port they were operating out of too. But so they had to redesign how they sucked seawater into the submarine so they didn't get so much sediment and whatnot. See, the first missile test caused a hydraulic failure in the launcher itself. And remember, there's no way into the submarine from the launcher, thank goodness. So whenever the exhaust damaged the missile body and the launcher, it didn't set a fire inside the submarine. So after that test, they tried a second test, which revealed that the missile exhaust was damaging the missile before the missile could leave the tube. So remember, this is a rocket-pushed weapon initially. Well, that rocket motor was creating such high temperatures inside the launch tube that it was damaging the missile body. So they had to figure out how they're going to, let that exhaust go in a different direction so it didn't go back on the missile itself. And by the third test, they had a successful test after changes were made to the tube. And I'll point out some of those changes here as soon as we get a photo of it. Let's continue with K-45. K-45, in June 1961, she became operational, again, operating in the Pacific. She's based out of Krashenkov Bay. In 1964, she does conduct her first patrol. So she's finally operational, 1964. She does a second patrol in 1966 and is dry docked for maintenance in 1968. It is expected that in the period of time between 64 and 68, she was successful in placing herself within strike distance of the Panama Canal. In 1970, the missile tubes were removed and she was converted to Project 659T. T is for torpedo. So what they did here is, because of the success of the Hotel SSGN and the inaccuracies of the P-5 missile, which was the Shattuck missile they were originally using, they decided to get rid of the missile launchers entirely, rebuild the submarine or modify the submarine just to be a torpedo submarine, a fast attack, basically. Basically a November, but it is still an Echo, it's an Echo T now, T for torpedo. That happens in 1970. Eventually, every one of the Echo 1s will get this modification. They do not stay in SSGN very long, again, because of the failures of the P-5 Shattuck missile and the success of the ballistic missiles, the Hotel class submarine. So in 1972, she's patrolling in the Philippine Sea as a fast attack submarine, and she does hunt a U.S. battle group successfully. She finds them, shadows them. The United States knows that she's there, but it doesn't really matter because she's just hunting them. In 1976, she does push all the way into the Indian Ocean, which is a very long-range deployment from her home base there in the Sea of Okhotsk. On September 10th, 1981, she collides with a trawler on the surface at night, damaging her bow sonar and the outer hull, as you can see here in the picture. There were no injuries, on board, but the trawler did sink. So they had to save the trawler crew after they rammed into her. And a few years later, in 1989, she is finally removed from service. And that is K-45, the very first Echo 1. All right, before we get into the second Echo 1, the K-59, I want to point out the missile deflecting shields you can see here in this photo. They are angled at approximately a 30-degree angle facing forward, and that is a modification made after the second test where they realized it was the rocket exhaust damaging the missile in the launcher. So now the rocket exhaust is vented out at an angle away from the missile launcher. Okay, in December 1961, K-59 enters service. In June 1962, the first patrol of Sea of Okhotsk and Pacific Ocean lasted about 42 days. The captain is awarded the Order of Lenin because, again, this is the early days of naval submarine nuclear power. So each one of these is like setting a record. And they're proving the concept works by being underway for 42 days. In 1966, conducting an uneventful patrol in the Pacific, and in 1970, she is again modified to the Project 659T. They take the missiles off, they expand the torpedo room to hold more torpedoes, and she becomes a fast attack boat in 1970. Now, again, this is not due to any failing of the submarine crew. It's just the other designs are better, and this P-5 missile, the Shattuck missile, isn't that good. Okay, 1974, she's deployed to the Indian Ocean, again demonstrating her range and capability. In 1975, she does track and evades 2 U.S. destroyers in the South China Sea. So here, the destroyers do detect her, but are unable to prosecute her in this example. And so that is a victory for the crew and the captain in 1975. In 1982, her reactor is refueled, and she deploys to the South China Sea in 1984 and the Indian Ocean in 1986. Again, serving without incident, a very successful career for K-59, where she is finally removed from service in 1989. All right, K-66, the third Echo one. 1964, she's operational. 1965 to 70, she conducts 3 patrols in the Pacific Ocean, where she successfully operates in the vicinity of Seattle, Pearl Harbor, and San Diego. So she's achieving her strategic missile mission as a GN. In May 1966, there's a fire in the engine room that damages equipment, but there's no injuries. It has started when RP-46 ammunition catches fire. So that is 7.62 rifle ammunition stored in the engine room, but it was stored improperly and exploded, basically, catching a fire. But thankfully, nobody was hurt, though. In 1970, she participated in Ocean 70. Obviously, the 70 is the year of which the operations take place. Ocean 70 war games, and conducted a simulated missile attack on a simulated target, just proving the concept of the missile and it working. But in December 1970, same year, she's converted back to 659T. They take the missiles off of her, and she becomes basically a fast attack from 1971 on. In 1977 and 1979, she does deploy to the Philippine Sea, looking for those American fleets. In 1979, an oil leak in the engine room loses 6 tons of oil. This is a lot of oil, and it's a huge cleanup, but thankfully it does not catch fire. It doesn't cause any injuries, but it's that she has to return to port immediately and replace all this oil. It's a huge mess back there. But luckily, it wasn't any worse. In 1981, there's a leak detected in the primary loop. Now, this is a big problem because the primary loop of the reactor is the loop of liquid water, pressurized water, that covers the fuel, keeps it cool. So if you have a leak in that, one, you're going to lose pressure so that water will eventually turn to steam and then bleed off even more through this leak, uncovering the fuel, and the fuel in the reactor will begin to melt. So they need to fix this right away. She does return to port. They isolate the primary loop, but they move her into a reserve position, and she doesn't go to sea again after 1981 because of this leak in the primary loop. And eventually in 1986, she is officially removed from service. This is before hulls 1 and 2 are, but it's all because of this reactor problem that she had. All right, K-122. She goes operational in 1962. She is the 4th one built. In August 1963, while at periscope depth, the reactor watch found water in the reactor compartment. It's really bad. It's determined to be wastewater and cleaned up by the crew. Now, the wastewater might be a problem with the translation from the Russian logs to English. It's not clear if the water was waist high or if it was actually wastewater. I'm going with it was wastewater, probably radioactive, but it was cleaned up by the crew and there was no more details about this. But this was potentially a serious reactor incident covered up by the Russian Navy. But all it was officially is determined to be wastewater cleaned up by the crew in 1963. September 1963, she suffered a loss of hydraulics to the bow planes, resulting in a depth excursion. This is really dangerous and terrifying when it happens. This is where you lose hydraulic pressure to the control planes, and the control planes, because of gravity, can default to the downward position forcing your submarine to go nose down towards the bottom. And if this happens unexpectedly, it's quite an experience. The crew did recover the dive before they exceeded test depth, and they returned to port for repairs. In 1968, okay, so this is before the other projects. In 1968, she is converted to Project 659T. So she was one of the first ones to be converted basically back into a fast attack SSN submarine. They take off the missiles, and she's on her way. In 1970, she does take part in war games, Ocean 70, but she struck a coral reef on a dive to 200 meters. So she basically dove in water that was too shallow, at too steep of an angle, and before they could pull out of the dive, they crashed into a coral reef. After inspection, she continued with the war games and did a successful attack on cruiser Varyag. So even with this damage, it wasn't enough to keep her from participating in war games. On December 1970, a fire in the engine room led to the loss of propulsion. There were no injuries, but there was a loss of trash disposal. So they had no way of getting trash off the boat while they were underway. So what the captain decided to do was to use one of the torpedo tubes to eject trash forward. The problem with doing this is that the torpedo tubes are not designed for that, and part of the trash ended up fouling the outer doors, preventing them from being shut. So now she's limited in speed and in depth, and she can't shut the outer doors, which means she can't open the inner door to shoot trash anymore. And because of all these incidents, hitting the reef, having the fire, fouling his torpedo tubes, the captain is eventually relieved of command. Not for any one thing, but just because of a series of poor decision making. All right, K-122 continued in 1980. There's a fire in the engine room. It burns for 8 minutes, and the crew ends up abandoning the compartment and letting it burn itself out. And they flood it with the Freon extinguishing agents that displaces all the oxygen. But the fire gets so hot, it melts the seals in compartment 9. People in compartment 9 without breathing protection succumb to the smoke and die. Compartment 9 is all the way at the aft end of the submarine, and between them and the forward end was a huge fire. They couldn't get out of compartment 9. There's no escape hatch. There's nowhere for these people to go, and they ended up just succumbing to smoke. They do surface in radio headquarters. The training ship Meridian takes the sub in tow 3 days later. The 14 sailors die due to carbon monoxide poisoning. That's the total number eventually after the fire is out. The event is investigated and reinvestigated 4 times, each time coming to a different conclusion. One conclusion being the crew was at fault. The second conclusion being that the design of the submarine was at fault. And each time somebody was accused or found at fault, they would petition to have the investigation reopened to exonerate themselves. So between the submarine designers and the crew, this investigation went back and forth for years, 4 times, alternating, blaming basically everybody. In 1985, she was finally removed from service. Okay, K-151, Echo 1, number 5. 1963, she's operational, transiting to her new home. The steam generator leaked inboard, but there was no injuries. But now she's a brand new submarine with a leaky steam generator, and that's not a good start for her. In 1965, successful rocket attack on beach targets during war games. She actually does shoot the rockets during these war games, demonstrating that they do work. And the redesign of the exhaust does not damage the missile in 1965. Everyone's very happy. In 1969 and 70, she deploys to the Pacific off the coast of the United States. In 1974, she is converted to Project 659T, where her missiles are removed, and she becomes a fast attack submarine, basically a November. In 1975, she does participate in war games as a torpedo boat, and she does deploy to the Indian Ocean in 1978. June 1984, there's a fire in the engine room, and it's not isolated in time and ends up killing 2 sailors, and they have to abandon compartment 7 again. So they don't have a good history of extinguishing these fires, even though they have the Freon extinguishing agents, which would essentially smother the fire by displacing the oxygen. Even with that, they can't isolate these fires in time. They lose 2 more sailors. In 1985, the next year, there was flooding in compartment 6 and limits the sub to 40 meters depth, lest the flooding gets worse. So she has to pull into port and get that fixed. She ends up just being removed from service without getting everything back together again in 1989. So a little bit of a troubled history for K-151, the final Echo 1. After this, they went to the Echo 2 design, which we will talk about in a different lecture. But this is the 5th and final Echo 1 that lived its life very briefly as an SSGN, and every one of them spent the second half of their life as an SSN. So she was an experiment, and as you can see, there was only one real successful hull. All the other hulls had major problems, including reactor incidents and death. So my final thoughts on this are, this was a flawed and failed SSGN design, but to Russia's credit, they recognized this early in the operational stage of the Echo 1 and converted her to a torpedo boat. A lot of the faults were not with the submarine itself. It was with the weapon system, the P5 Shattuck being inaccurate and just didn't accomplish the mission that it needed to do, or it didn't do the mission as well as the Hotel Ballistic Missile class submarine that we'll talk about in a different lecture did. So they just converted her to a torpedo boat and went on, ending up redesigning her entirely as a Echo 2 that we'll talk about later. She was slow as an SSN. She wasn't quite as fast as the November, who was designed from the ground up as a fast attack. So because they had remodeled her and refitted her as an SSN, she was never as good as the November SSN that was designed to be that mission from the get-go. This just proves that not all experiments succeed. It did succeed in identifying failures. They probably didn't need to build 5 of these to realize these failures. And to their credit, they didn't build 6. They cut their losses, they redesigned, and they went on with the Echo 2 design in the future. And we will talk about Project 675, the Echo 2, next time right here. I want to say thank you very much to all the Patreons. You guys supporting this channel means a lot to me. And I want to recognize the division officers this month, Brandon Ferry, Scott Borg, and Sean O'Neill. These guys are extremely generous, and I want to thank them personally and by name for being division officers here on the Jive Turkey Patreon page. All right, so that is the Echo 1 project. I will see you guys next time for the Echo 2, and thanks for watching. Bye.